年的时候，他第一次宣教是到中国。
I smuggled Bibles into China.
偷运圣经。
And met with some house church leaders there that so impacted my life.
然后也遇到一些地下教会的一些领袖，很
And I
让他震动。
think God gave me that experience early on in my ministry.
所以神在我开始的侍奉的时候有这样的经验。
So that I would always have a heart for China and Asia and His plans in the future.
所以我的心也是非常向着亚洲和中国，还有他的对他们的计划。
But later He focused us. My wife and I, we got married and then ended up going to the Middle East.
然后后来他遇到他的妻子，然后神就把他们转向中东。
We've been there as missionaries for 22 years.
我们在中东有22年。
And we've worked for the first many years in an effort to reach Muslims and do evangelism and church planting among Muslims.
所以一开始是要在那里去宣教给穆斯林的人，然后也要在那里种教会。
Later in that time, during that time that I was reaching out to Muslims, my wife would go to Israel and she wrote a book on Israel.
然后当我在宣教给穆斯林的人的时候，我的妻子就到以色列去，然后也写了一本书关于以色列。
She's a photographer and she compiled a book with both Jewish people and Palestinians and an understanding of their hearts as families.
然后他的妻子是专业的摄影师，所以他的书里面有他的一些图片的作品，然后和他认为神要给以色列人和巴基斯坦人的一些计划。
Then in 1999, we made a real shift in our focus from Muslim evangelism to more of a worship and prayer focus.
然后1999年的时候，我跟我的妻子的这个意向就从一个宣教和栽种教会转变成敬拜和赞美神、祷告。
And we began connecting together with others in the Middle East region, and then we discovered IHOP was starting around that same time in Kansas City.
然后那时候我们就在中东，就是到处去跟别人连接，然后去找有相同呼召的人，然后那个时候IHOP 在 Kansas City 也同时开始。
So our focus began to be clearly on the idea of raising up houses of prayer throughout the Middle East and bringing them together in relationship.
那所以我们的意向就成为在中东要兴起很多的祷告室，然后让这些穆斯林的人都能够连接起来。
So we had connection with in those early days in the year 1999, 2000 with Rick Ridings and Tom Hess and others that were already beginning houses of prayer in Jerusalem.
所以1999年的时候，就跟 Rick Riding、Tom Hess 在耶路撒冷的祷告室就连接起来了。
But we also wanted to see houses of prayer raised up in the nations of Egypt and Lebanon and Jordan and Turkey and so on.
可是我们那时候的负担也不光是在耶路撒冷，也要在中东，像埃及、黎巴嫩、约旦，还有土耳其这些国家也要兴起祷告室。
So that's what we've done for the last 15 years is help with the encouraging and establishing of houses of prayer and networking them together.
所以我们在过去的15年中，就在兴起祷告室，然后也在跟别的祷告室能够连接。
Now there's a passage in the Bible that speaks about a time when worship is going to be raised up in the Middle East and those nations will worship together.
那圣经里面有一章经节，就是预言了在中东就会有很多的祷告和敬拜，都在中东的这个地方。
Actually, there are many passages, but one that stands out is Isaiah 19.
其实圣经上有很多地方都有讲到这样的事情，可是最引人注目的就是以赛亚书19章。
So many of the houses of prayer now in the Middle East have regular Isaiah 19 watches or sets.
所以很 很多祷告室现在都有经常是在按照以赛亚书19章来祷告敬拜。
Where they not only pray for their own city or nation, but they pray for the Middle East and what God's doing to heal those nations.
所以不光是为自己的城市、自己的国家，也为中东，也为中东的医治、中东的投向神来祷告。
So the last few years, I've been working on a book to give understanding and a fuller explanation of what I believe God intends to do to fulfill Isaiah 19.
所以过去几年，我就把神给我的这些意象和我认为是要神在中东做的这些事情，写了一本书。
And so I don't have copies with me. This is Gina's copy. So if you'd like to get it, it's available on Amazon. I'm praying, and you can pray with me that it get translated into Chinese.
所以我身上没有多余的，可是如果你们可以在 Amazon 可以找到，希望能够今后能够把它翻成中文。
It speaks about when God's going to reconcile the nation of Egypt and those nations under the term of Assyria with Israel, and they'll all worship together.
就是说就是神会让埃及和叙利亚和以色列能够在神的里面和好，然后来敬拜神。
I'll just take a moment because I want to be sure. Assyria is really all of the other Middle East nations. It's not just Syria.
Oh,
Assyria, which was the empire.
亚述就是讲的是中东所有的其他的国家，不光只是叙利亚。
Assyria in Isaiah's day covered the nations today of Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, Jordan, Turkey, Iran, basically all the other Middle East nations.
所有别的国家。
So that's what God's doing. He's raising up houses of prayer. I was just sharing at Convergence House of Prayer that now we have around 50 houses of prayer in those nations. Some of them 24/7. Others, they're pursuing that.
所以刚刚在 Convergence House 跟他们分享，就现在已经有50家，大概有50家的祷告室，然后有的是24小时7天，有的是不是，所以。
Each year we hold a conference in the island of Cyprus, just near Turkey, and invite those house of prayer leaders to come to Cyprus to meet together.
塞浦路斯。
每一年在那个岛上会有一个特会，然后大家都会到那个岛上来敬拜神。
And so we'll have our 14th conference, Middle East conference, in Cyprus in September this year.
所以今年9月就有第14届的特会。
And because we've been meeting for so many years, we have a deep level of friendship and trust.
因为我们在那个土地上耕耘了那么久，所以我们在那里有很深的跟那里的人有很深的感情，也有很深的信任。
So much so that now we're preparing a cooperative training program for the whole of the Middle East.
所以我们现在就开始有一个很集中的一个培训的一个课程，来为这个中东。
So we'll have young people can come from America or Europe or Asia and go through a training program where they'll be able to serve in multiple houses of prayer in the Middle East.
所以这个培训就会有从美国，还有从欧洲或者是亚洲来的年轻人来培训，怎么样去为中东来祷告、来敬拜。
We have our U.S. base in Colorado, and we're moving our whole team over to Cyprus in August to begin the development of this training program in the Middle East.
我们在美国的中心是在Colorado。那8月份我们会把整个团队都带到塞浦路斯。
So if in the future you have young people or others who'd like to come and join the houses of prayer and serve in Israel and Egypt and Lebanon and Turkey and Jordan, please send them to us and we'll help train them and get them into those houses of prayer.
如果你们中间有年轻人或者你们的孩子有对中东有负担的话，请 请来找他。
So I want to take a few more minutes to show a video that kind of gives an overview of this again, and I hope you enjoy it.
现在想给你们大家分享一个影片，因为没有什么问题，他可以帮你们解答。
Hopefully you're getting a picture of what's happening in the Middle East and the networking together of the houses of prayer.
希望你们能够看到在中东的这个意象，然后神在那里。
Yes.
Just out of curiosity, why Bermuda, why Cyprus? Because it's a center of intelligence for like everything. End of the end time will happen around this area.
Yes. Well, yes, absolutely. Cyprus is the best location to serve all of those nations and bring believers together. It's very difficult for them to go from Egypt to Israel or Lebanon and so on, or even to go from Israel to those nations. The governments usually are very suspicious and they watch the believers trying to do that. But when they travel to Cyprus, it's a European nation, just a few miles off the coast. It's like we can gather them in conferences freely. We can talk freely about what we're doing. It's the best place to gather them together over the years that we've found. Though we try to have them meet together in their nations. Oh, I talked too long.
刚刚问题就是为什么是塞浦路斯这个岛？解答就是因为塞浦路斯是一个比较不是那么政治敏感的一个地方。那别人可以从埃及到这个岛上，然后从以色列到这个岛上，因为这个岛是一个欧洲的一个领土，所以就不会那么政治上那么敏感，然后会比较能够在一个综合的地方聚会。
Okay, I'm assuming when you call yourself forerunners, you're thinking about preparing the way of the Lord, right?
所以我想你们叫自己是先锋，是因为我们要为神做先锋。
So those of us as believers living in the Middle East are very, for the most part, involved in trying to understand how we prepare the way of the Lord.
那我们在中东，我们也是神的先锋，然后我们要理解神是让我们怎么来准备。
So I don't have time to share a lot about some of this, but I'll explain from one passage about Cyprus.
那有一个是解释塞浦路斯这个岛的，就是有一节经文。
You may have heard Daniel Lim mention Kittim House of Prayer, or Kittim.
刚刚那个 Daniel Lim 他有讲 Kittim 是祷告。
Kittim is the Hebrew word for Cyprus in the Old Testament. Daniel 11. So
Kittim 是在但以理书11章。
In Daniel 11 verses 30 to 32, there's a very important passage about what's going to happen towards the end before Jesus comes back.
但以理书11章30节，神有一个很精准的描述，是他要怎么样做这个事情。
Daniel gives explanation about the Antichrist and certain things that he will do to oppose God's plans in the Middle East.
但以理书有说，在末代的时候，这个敌基督他会怎么样去反对信神的人，怎么样反对神在地上的作为。
He will, at some point, it says actually in verse 29, he will go and attempt to conquer or take control of Egypt.
在29章，他有讲说，这个敌基督他会怎么样去把埃及给夺回来。
It's referred to as the South, or the king of the South is always, in this context, Egypt.
有讲是南方的国，那这个地方就是讲的埃及。
Then it says ships from the land of Kittim.
然后说第
I hope
30
the Chinese version is the same as the Hebrew.
第30节说，因为因为基提战船必来攻击他，是基提。
So yeah, you have to go back to the Hebrew. It says ships from the land of Kittim.
那希伯来文就是说，基提战船
will oppose the Antichrist,
就会来攻
resist
击
him.，
就会来攻击这个敌基督。
And he will lose heart, the Antichrist.
那敌基督就会丧胆，
So much so that he goes back and he breaks a covenant that he made with Israel.
他到丧胆的一个地步，就是他会回来联络背弃圣约的人。
And he sets up the abomination of desolation in verse 31.
然后他第31节说，他必兴兵，这兵必亵渎圣地。
Now, Jesus and Paul both spoke about this was the primary sign of the end.
那耶稣和保罗都讲，这就是末世的最重要的一个征兆。
He said, Jesus said, and Paul said, when you see these things coming, the end is coming.
那耶稣和保罗都说，当你看到这些事情发生的时候，末世就到了。
In fact, Jesus said for the Jewish people to flee Jerusalem when the abomination of desolation is set up in the temple.
那耶稣说，这个时候就要叫犹太人逃离耶路撒冷，因为这个时候就是敌基督设立那行毁坏可憎的。
Because it's that abomination of the Antichrist putting an idol of himself in the temple that's going to cause desolation for the last 3.5 years of this age.
这个行毁坏可憎的敌基督会把这个东西放在这个圣殿里面，他们就会来祭渎这个圣地。
But verse 32 is a very notable or known verse.
那第32章是很有名的一节。
It says towards the end, the people who know their God will be strong and resist him, the Antichrist.
32
Yeah, at the end of 32. Those who know their God.
最后就是讲，唯独认识神的子民必刚强行事。
So we all know that verse.
我们都知道这一节。
The people who know their God and are strong will do exploits or resist the Antichrist.
就是认识神的子民都会做很伟大、很刚，就是很。
But that's a direct reference to this resistance coming from Cyprus.
可是就是讲说这个其实是讲是说在这个岛上。
It's referring back to who resisted the Antichrist, who stopped him from deceiving the nations.
是在这个塞普莱斯岛的这个上面，这些信徒来做这个反对敌基督的事情。
And it, of course, relates to many other passages that'll be happening at the same time with the 2 prophets in Jerusalem and the 144,000.
当然还有别的很多的征兆，144万人的信徒。
So it's not only what's happening from Cyprus. God's raised up other witnesses against the Antichrist in Israel and the earth.
所以这些征兆不光是在塞普莱斯岛，也在别的地方也会有。
But we know Cyprus has a very strategic role at the end in God's plan to resist the Antichrist.
所以，可是这个塞普莱斯岛是一个很有策略性的一个地方，是神要用来兴起来做他的事情。
So that's another key reason for us building the house of prayer and prayer movement together with those in Israel. I mean Cyprus.
所以这也是为什么我们要在那里建这个岛。
Now Cyprus and Israel in the last few years have developed a much closer relationship, which is key to this all happening too.
那过去几年，塞浦路斯岛和耶路撒冷也有建立更加巩固关系，所以也是在因为这个境界。
And they're sharing the exploration of natural gas discoveries in the Mediterranean and wanting to develop those.
然后他们也有在用自然天然气的这些天然的这些资源来为这个中东的这个兴旺在。
Some of the largest natural gas discoveries in the earth are now being found between Cyprus and Israel in the Mediterranean.
现在就是最大的天然气的资源就是在这个以色列和这个塞浦路斯岛中间，还有这个 Mediterranean.
So there's an increasing cooperation taking place between the nation of Cyprus and Israel.
所以这个国跟国之间有进一步的就是联合来其实是为了以色列的这个
Economically,
经济上的，还有
politically.
各个还有这个政治上的一些促成他们的合作。
Yes. So I think Cyprus is strategic for a number of reasons, and hopefully that's helpful.
所以这个塞浦路斯岛是一个非常有策略性的一个地方。
Okay. Any other questions?
还有别的问题吗？
So your annual conference or your annual prayer meeting, do you have it actually on your website?
We have a separate website, and because we need to be careful about security in the Middle East, like you do in China.
对，因为中东这地方很敏感，所以就是要小心。所以他们这特会的这个网站是分开的，是跟他的网站是分开的，因为那里太敏感，所以这些东西都要比较小心一点。
We usually make it available by invitation and let people know how to register through the website. But we are very open to whom God wants to bring.
一般我们都是用邀请的方法来，就是邀请别人来参加这个特会。可是我们会就是神要我们请谁，我们都会很。
We'll have about 120 people. It's not a large gathering, but it's representing the leaders of the houses of prayer in the Middle East.
一般大概有120多人，然后他们都是这些祷告殿的领袖。
And then some people from other nations. So we've had Korean leaders come, and we'd love to have the Chinese and Back to Jerusalem movement connect into what we're doing more with these houses of prayer in Cyprus.
我们也有韩国的一些领袖来，我们也很欢迎有中国的这个教会来参加，尤其是回归耶路撒冷的这个运动。
下就是刚刚有讲到那个是 training 是不是？会更多一点介绍，好像是说青年人可以过去，那一起多少时间或怎么样
Can you just elaborate on the training program?
Yes, the training program is a program we've just started pioneering ourselves, but we'll be working with the houses of prayer on.
Like she wants to know the details, like young people, how long is the course,
Okay.
how many people, or the requirements, or.
Right. So we have 2 times when they can begin the training, one in the summer and one in January.
然后一个是夏天开，然后还有一次是1月份开。
In the summer, we have them come to Colorado, where our base is in
夏
Colorado.
天的时候是在 Colorado。
And then they begin with a 6-week training or orientation time.
应该是有六个星期的6个星期的训练，新生训练。
And we work on having a balance of both the expression of intimacy through the house of prayer and outreach and missions to others.
我们要综合这个跟神亲密的关系，也要向外去宣教。
So the name of the school is Intimacy and Missions, and our website is intimacyandmissions.org.
所以这个学校就是亲密宣教 ，intimacyandmission.org 是它的网站。
And so then once they complete that, we bring them over to the Middle East, and we begin to introduce them to the houses of prayer and the nations of the Middle East.
然后他们完成了这个新生训练的时候，我们就会把他带到中东去，跟中东各个的祷告殿联系，然后教他们怎么样去为那里的地方祷告。
And so what our plan is, like with the house of prayer in Jerusalem with Rick, Sukkot Hillel, they'll spend 3 months, and then they'll come back to Cyprus, and then go to maybe a house of prayer in Turkey for 3 months, and then back to Cyprus, and then to Egypt for 3 months, for a 2-year period.
所以有2年的时候，他们就会在中东的各个祷告殿循环，比如说在耶路撒冷的祷告殿有3个月的时间，然后回到这个希伯来斯岛，然后再去埃及的一个祷告殿，然后再去那里训练3个月的时间，然后再回到希伯来斯岛，然后再去土耳其或者是别的，所以一共有2年的时间。
They don't have to come for the whole 2 years, but we'll provide a 2-year kind of program or internship they can follow.
他们并不是非要完成2年的这个时间，也可以，可是他这个 program 总共会有2年。
Most of the houses of prayer have a problem with visas.
一般的祷告店都会跟那个签证都会有一些困难。
In Israel, you only get a 3-month visa and then you need to leave.
在以色列只能签证签3个月的时间，然后就得离开。
It's similar in Turkey and other nations of the Middle East. So this way rather than losing young people after 3 months, we're helping them to go to the next house of prayer and we're keeping them in the region.
那在土耳其还有中东别的国家也有相同的问题。那如果是在这个 program 里面的话，就不会因为签证的关系不能够留下来，他就可以在中东。
And they get a fuller understanding of all that God's doing and His heart for all of those peoples.
就可以比较完整的去经历神在这个中东还有整个的这个计划。
So they'll learn about the house of prayer in each of those nations as well as the culture, a little bit of the language, and how to reach out to those people in that nation.
也可以就是在每个国家能够不光是去学会怎么样为他祷告，也可以学会他的语言，还有他的文化，就是比较能够更加融入当地的这个。
And so we believe that this will help to raise up leaders for this next generation to help with the house of prayer movement maturing into its fullness.
那这样子就可以为这个在这个去受训的人就可以以后就可以形成作为领袖来帮助神在下一代的这个祷告的这个运动中能够更加的兴起发光。
So if you think of us to pray for our team as we move out, we're helping to kind of lay the structure and foundation for this for young people to come in the years ahead.
所以希望你们也能够为我们祷告，因为我们现在就是在做这个打基础的这个工作，然后是为了以后让这个年轻人能够来，然后能够更加的去完整、比较成熟的来领受这个神的意象。
The second time they can join us is in January in Cyprus, and we'll start them in through this process from Cyprus. So we'll be ready to have some people come and join us in January if you know of young people who'd like to come.
那第二轮就是1月份开始，那1月份开始的时候，这个中心就会在Cyprus，所以你们如果认识或者是知道有人想要参加的话，可以去找他。
Amen?
Amen.
Okay. Any other questions?
还有别的问题吗？
关于他们金钱方面财务的
是学费吗？还是帮助？
我你也帮我问刚刚，我只想说那个多少钱，但是还有他们的整个施工。
She's asking what's the tuition for the program, and also if you need any financial support.
Oh, thank you for asking.
谢谢你问。
We basically are, with our team, going to find out what the tuition and the budget would be for students to do the whole 2-year program. We don't have that yet determined.
还没有确定，就是要根据那个学生有兴趣的学生，他们能够付，就是他们的经费能够承担，再更一步的能够确定。
You can imagine for 2 years it's going to be quite a bit of money that they'll have to raise, and my estimation right now is for like a 3-month period. It would be almost with the travel and housing and food and everything, about $9,000 for 3 months. So if you just multiply that, times 8.
所以我现在打算是大概，我现在估计大概3个月，包括行程啊，还有各种加起来大概要9000块钱。那你这样子乘以8的话，2年的时间，所以这蛮多钱的。
It's almost like $3,000 a month.
可能3000块钱1个月。
With their living and food and additional travel and the costs of the training, every place they're going, I think is fairly reasonable.
所以3000块钱1个月大概是包括他们的住宿，还有吃饭，还有旅游，还有各种各样的，所以应该还是比较合理的。
We don't know of anything that's even closely resembling this kind of cooperation in the Middle East. And thank God the church is leading the way. The House of Prayer movement is leading the way.
所以这个是在我知道范围之内是没有是这样子配合神的这个做工的，所以我们很感谢神能够现在兴起这个祷告运动，还有这教会来带领这个事工。
God has the answer to the Middle East conflict, and I believe the prayer movement and the believers are the ones who are going to lead the way in revealing that to the world.
我相信神在中东的这个地方，他有答案，他也知道怎么样解决，那也是会把这个答案给这个祷告运动的这些领袖们。
Before I mention our own personal support needs, I just want to highlight again, this year alone, there are 6 gatherings in the Middle East focused on reconciliation of the nations in Isaiah 19 in the Middle East.
光是今年就已经有6个为这个以赛亚书19章的这个预言祷告的这个特会。
I joined a gathering of 250 Koreans in southern Turkey in February with the focus of teaching and training many of them on Isaiah 19.
在南土耳其，他跟大概250个韩国的领袖来为这个以赛亚书19来祷告，来有这个就是传授的这个负担。
Another Korean group invited me to Cairo to dedicate a house of prayer for Koreans moving and establishing house of prayer in Cairo with the focus for Isaiah 19.
又有另外一个韩国的请他去埃及的 Cairo 来就是为他们那里的祷告殿，还有为这个以赛亚书19章的这个预言来dedicate 做开幕仪式吧。
Yeah, and then in Turkey, another gathering by Tom Hess of leaders from all over the Middle East focused on Isaiah 19 was held.
Tom Hess 他的那个万国祷告殿也是为了这个以赛亚书19章来做了一个特会。
Last month there was a gathering in Jerusalem at Christ Church of a number of believers, many of them from a Muslim background who now believe in Jesus, coming at their own risk from Iraq and Egypt and other places to Jerusalem to meet with Messianic believers in Jerusalem for Isaiah 19.
上个月就光是上个月有很多穆斯林国家的这些人，他们自己冒险到从伊拉克还有就是这些穆斯林国家的人到耶路撒冷来有一个特会。
They had many problems with the visas to get them into Iraq. In fact, the Iranian believers who were planning to come were not allowed in because of the conflict between Israel and Iran.
有很多签证上的问题，因为这个政治上的这个分歧，他们非常难进耶路撒冷的这个签证的过程非常艰难。
And then we'll hold our conference in September in Cyprus with people from all over the Middle East for Isaiah 19.
然后9月份又要有一个为了以赛亚书19章的一个特会。
And then David Damien, many of you may know, he's hosting a conference in Jerusalem in November, very much going to be focused on the theme of Isaiah 19, and people from all over the world are coming to that.
David Damien 他会11月份有一个回家的特会在耶路撒冷。也是 focus 在，也是关注在以赛亚书19。
There's a real increase of revelation and interest to pray for the fulfillment of Isaiah 19 all through the Middle East and around the world.
所以现在很多人都要兴起为中东还有为全世界祷告。
So personally, as a ministry, with our team moving out for this next year to Cyprus and helping with the houses of prayer, we're asking the Lord for about $350,000 that we need to raise as a team. So if you could pray with us for the release of that $350,000, that's what we need as we budgeted for our team to do what we're going to do over the next year.
那从个人的方面，还有就是整个团队要去去做这个施工，大概他的估计是要35万，所以求神能够 给他开路，他在这个
那
金钱上面有供应。
I have our little prayer card with our financial needs. I could leave if you'd like to be in touch with us to help in that way.
他这里有个祷告卡，如果大家想要跟他联系的话，他可以把这个留下来。
We start the school in Colorado in 2 weeks, and then we leave 6 weeks later for going over to Cyprus and Egypt and Turkey and Israel for the next year.
所以2个礼拜以后，他的这个第一期的这个课就开始了，然后他们就6个礼拜之后，新生培训完之后，他们就会去中东各个国家去做进一步的培训。
So thank you. I don't know if there's anything else I don't.
还有什么问题吗？